Coming up, she wanted to get out her insults. She wanted to get on video. She wanted to be talked about on Twitter, and the far left, which has come to control so much of the Democratic Party, will love her for it. And that's a shame. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, I've talked before about how our First Amendment rights are under threat. I'm far from alone in expressing concerns that the attitudes of many young persons in America are not nearly so supportive of the First Amendment as they were in my youth. But this latest example of a lack of support for First Amendment principles comes not from youth, but from someone somewhat older, although not as old as me, but disconcertingly, he's from the news media. Andrew Marantz, a writer at The New Yorker, recently spoke at Berkeley regarding free speech. He decried what he characterized as free speech absolutism and asserted that the marketplace of ideas doesn't work. As campus reform Celine Ryan noted on November 6, Marantz asserted that allowing free speech on social media is like throwing a party and allowing the attendees to set a couch on fire. You might be very concerned about the fact that a couch was set on fire, but you never did anything to prepare for that possibility. Frankly, I'm tired of people who don't appreciate or apparently even understand the First Amendment, even when it's critical to their own jobs, endlessly using variations on the yelling fire in a crowded theater analogy. Nothing about social media is the equivalent of setting a couch on fire at a party. The correct analogy to free speech is somebody at a party saying, "I should have the right to set a couch on fire at a party," and somebody else saying, "No, you shouldn't." At the point that somebody actually engages in illegal conduct, such as actually soliciting people to set couches on fire at parties, for example, the correct response remains the rebuttal. Just as it's easy to win an argument about whether people should be able to go to parties and set couches on fire there, it should be easy to win arguments with people who espouse truly extremist beliefs, such as Nazism, for example. I suspect that part of Mr. Marantz's problem with the First Amendment is that he's characterizing as extremist some beliefs that are not extremist at all, but instead may very well be fairly mainstream conservative thought. It wouldn't be the first time that's happened. Some commentators, for example, have described online conservative personality Ben Shapiro as an extremist, which is a ridiculous contention. And anybody who does consider him to be an extremist will likely encounter what so many others have, which is a difficulty in defeating his arguments in debate. So what exactly does Mr. Marantz propose? Well, for one thing, he proposes that the guarantees of First Amendment rights on college campuses shouldn't be the interpretation taken of the First Amendment for time immemorial. In the fashion of those who claim that the Constitution should be treated as a living document, Marantz proposes that we should be able to change our interpretation of the law. Mr. Marantz is certainly willing to take away the First Amendment protections on college campuses for which the right has been fighting for years, and for which at one time the left also fought. Now think about the fact that Mr. Marantz is a member of the media. There was a time when we used to think that all members of the media were so dependent on the First Amendment, their jobs, their careers, their very professional purposes so intertwined with the First Amendment that they, of all people, would always understand how critical it is. Unfortunately, as with so many other things, the truth doesn't always live up to our expectations. It seems that Mr. Marantz, and for so many other members of the media, when their views, their causes, their political perspectives don't dominate elections and the people, then they think those First Amendment rights must be part of the problem. This is but one of the many reasons why it would be disastrous for the country for the left to win in 2020. Our most fundamental right, freedom of speech, is being challenged, and shockingly, part of that challenge is coming from those who are most dependent on those rights, writers and journalists. Truly sad. Next topic. Veterans Day and the fall of the Berlin Wall. This year, two commemorations fall on almost exactly the same day. Veterans Day is Monday, November 11, and the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall is November 9. Now, at first blush, many might think that those two commemorations aren't linked. And if you looked at some of the press coverage of the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, you wouldn't think so either. Take a look at the coverage of the event from the Associated Press, specifically an article entitled, "Germany Allies Mark 30 Years Since Berlin Wall Fell," authored by Frank Jordans and dated November 9. The article appeared in numerous publications, including the Washington Post. It includes this simple statement, which is so staggeringly bereft of historical context that I'm not sure whether the author is ignorant of the historical details or is deliberately trying to downplay the importance of Western resistance, especially Western military and political resistance, to the Soviet bloc. Specifically, the author said, quote, "The collapse of the Berlin Wall was brought about largely by peaceful protests and the stream of people fleeing East Germany that piled pressure on the country's communist government to open its borders to the West and ultimately end the nation's post-war division." Close quote. Really? That's it? There were some peaceful protests and lo and behold the wall fell down? Apparently the massive commitment of American troops to protect Western Europe and wage a Cold War for decades, the unprecedented scale of Ronald Reagan's buildup of the American military to counter the Soviets at a time when we technically were not in a hot war, and which prompted the Soviets to overextend themselves trying to compete, America's clandestine supply of military weaponry to the Afghan resistance to the Soviets, which likewise stretched the USSR to the breaking point, the brave leadership of Lech Walesa, who withstood imprisonment to lead the Solidarity movement in Poland and start to break free from Soviet control, and the inspirational leadership of Pope John Paul, who joined with Reagan to inspire millions of Catholics in Europe to help break the back of godless communism, apparently were nowhere to be found in the list of causes of the fall of the Berlin Wall, if you listen to Mr. Jordan and what he has to say for the Associated Press. Frankly, I'm sick and tired of the press attempts to rewrite history to minimize the importance of the American military and American conservative political figures in many of the great achievements of the last 100 years. If you had to boil it down to three individuals most responsible for the end of the Cold War and the impending collapse of the Soviet Union, and therefore the fall of the Berlin Wall, it would be Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Lech Walesa, and there's not much argument about it. The media, which is so obviously on the left, just tries not to mention it. But I want to focus on something different. Rather than just a few high-profile, extremely powerful and prominent individuals, I want to focus on the millions who dedicated much of their lives, sometimes their entire lives, in service of the cause of defeating the Soviet Union and ensuring that it never was able to expand into Western Europe. From the Berlin airlift, which ensured the survival of the citizens of West Berlin, to the round-the-clock flights of American nuclear bombers sending the message to the Soviets that America was in a position to respond immediately to an attack, the American troops stationed in Germany and other hotspots ready to repel an armored invasion by the Soviets, to the endless string of NATO exercises ensuring that American and Allied troops would always be ready to take on the USSR should they move against the West, and ensuring that that message was always clear to the Soviets so that peace would result. American troops were the key to the freedom of Western Europe from the post-war 1940s until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. As we observe Veterans Day, among the many things for which we should be grateful are the sacrifices of American veterans who fought for so long in a war described as cold and which never became hot, in large part because America's soldiers, sailors, and airmen were so dedicated, so trained, and well-equipped that their enemies in the Soviet Union never dared to attack. Which is not to say that American and other NATO veterans didn't pay the ultimate price. In the Berlin airlift alone, aircraft accidents killed 40 British and 31 Americans, as well as 15 German civilians. At the peak of that airlift, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 30 seconds. How large was America's commitment of troops to Europe during the Cold War? At the peak, America had over 400,000 troops in Europe. But the reality is the number of American servicemen and women who dedicated their lives to fighting the Cold War goes far beyond those numbers. You'd be hard-pressed to find any American without relatives who did so, and some of the assignments were brutal in a way that you would never expect. My father volunteered to serve at a research facility on an iceberg. The scientists at the facility were conducting climate research. No, not the kind of climate research you think about today. They were studying the weather in the extreme North Arctic, almost to the North Pole, in preparation for establishment of the Distant Early Warning Line. What was that? The Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW Line, was a string of radar stations stretched across northern Canada to detect Soviet bombers approaching over the North Pole. I took a look at the photos we have from that site in preparation for this episode. Just a couple of Quonset huts and some tents clustered together on an ice island 3 miles by 7 miles wide, supplied by an airstrip that they struggled to keep open in the bitter cold, almost inconceivably desolate conditions. As a kid, I was always fascinated by the photo of the C-47 cargo aircraft that crashed trying to supply the facility, complete with the gash in the fuselage just below the cockpit where the propeller broke off, ripped through the skin of the plane, and miraculously cut the heel of the pilot's shoe without injuring him. Not only in light of Veterans Day, but also as we prepare for Thanksgiving, in anticipation of consuming mass quantities of our favorite dishes and treats, aware of the land of plenty which America has become, we should make an effort to be aware, to be reminded of, and recognize all the hard work and sacrifices of our men and women in uniform, including those who sacrificed for so many years in Europe and around the world to make sure that the free world remained free and that their strength and dedication ensured that the Cold War between the superpowers never became a hot war. And I'll be sure to think about that coldest of destinations, a floating ice island on which my father served throughout the Arctic dark season, not far from the North Pole, as part of his many contributions to the protection of America and the free world from the threat of communism that far too many Americans and one Associated Press reporter seem to have forgotten. Next topic. Debbie Wasserman Schultz disgraceful conduct. There are so many instances lately where politicians conduct themselves in a manner which is disgraceful, but it's hard to stand out from such a crowd. Well, one of my least favorite politicians, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz from South Florida, has somehow found a way to stand out. Have you seen her exchange with ICE Director Cuccinelli? Wasserman Schultz was objecting to the Trump administration's implementation of the public charge rule. So what's that? Going as far back as the 1800s, the United States has had laws restricting admissibility to the country of persons who are not able to care for themselves. Well, the Trump administration has issued a new rule to address that policy, which specifically identifies what constitutes being a public charge and what restrictions are imposed on immigration status based on being a public charge. The purpose, of course, is to make sure that immigrants to the United States are in fact able to support themselves. The rule includes numerous exceptions. For example, it doesn't apply to refugees, to persons seeking asylum, and individuals applying under the Violence Against Women Act. It doesn't apply to treatment of an emergency medical condition, aliens under the age of 21, and pregnant women. That's just a partial list of the exceptions. It's filled with them. It's certainly not what I would consider to be extreme or draconian. But that apparently is not the view taken by Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz. She had an exchange recently with ICE Director Cuccinelli which sets a new standard for obnoxious conduct by a congressperson. And keep in mind, Debbie Wasserman Schultz has long been perhaps the most extreme example of a member of Congress for which obnoxious conduct is the norm. So what did she do? Well, among other things, she accused Ken Cuccinelli of pursuing a white supremacist ideology. That's a quote, white supremacist ideology. I'm frankly sick of this. The left now throws out the label of white supremacist without any hesitation, as if it's a common attitude. So the administration is trying to adopt a policy which will ensure that immigrants can support themselves. That's helping to ensure that we continue to have the funds available to fund the social support programs for U.S. citizens, because those programs will not be stressed by applications for support from immigrants. That somehow, according to Debbie Wasserman Schultz, is a white supremacist ideology. That's absurd. In fact, because minorities are overrepresented among U.S. citizens in the lower income classes in America, the benefit of the public charge rule will fall disproportionately to the benefit of minorities. It's even more important to them than to white citizens that those social programs be available. The less those programs are strained by benefits committed to immigrants, the more likely those programs will have adequate funding going forward. Democrats used to recognize that, but seemingly not anymore, and certainly not for Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz didn't limit her criticism to a claim that Ken Cuccinelli was a white supremacist. She also claimed that he wanted to pursue his, quote, white supremacist ideology at all costs, even if it means making critically ill children near collateral damage in the process, close quote. Now, it's obvious Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz hasn't read the proposed rule, because, as I noted, it contains an exclusion for under 21-year-old immigrants. But I don't think that really matters to her. She wanted to get out her insults. She wanted to get on video. She wanted to be talked about on Twitter, and the far left, which has come to control so much of the Democratic Party, will love her for it. And that's a shame. Every time the label of racist and the label of white supremacist is thrown at someone without justification, it weakens the label. For many people, it's becoming nothing more than a substitute for saying, I disagree with you. Watch the video of Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz. You can find it in the October 30, 2019 edition of RealClearPolitics.com in an article by Ian Schwartz entitled, DWS versus Cuccinelli. You pursue heinous white supremacist ideology at all costs, even if children are collateral damage. I think you'll be as disgusted as I was. The Congresswoman doesn't just lob that incredibly offensive attack, but she then refuses to allow the witness to respond. The confrontation is one of the most anger-driven ones I've seen yet. Mr. Cuccinelli later made the point that the Congresswoman was hiding behind the insulation from liability that she's provided while speaking in Congress. Let's hope she chooses to repeat her claims in a location where she doesn't have protection from defamation suits. I'd love to see her lose a massive lawsuit. And I'll be back speaking next week, not before Congress, but rather before you, the listeners of Political Spirits. Hopefully you'll join me. And I should mention that listeners from 2 new states have joined us. Welcome aboard, listeners from Connecticut and Rhode Island. And no matter what state you're from, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.